The skyline of a modern Chinese metropolis like Shanghai or Shenzhen is a cathedral of glass, steel, and light, a testament to a secular miracle that has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty in a single generation. To walk these streets is to feel the pulse of a nation that has sprinted toward the future with a singular, material focus, guided by a philosophy of state atheism that views religious belief as a relic of a pre-scientific past. Yet, if one looks closely at the quiet corners of these metropolises, or journeys into the mist-shrouded villages of the rural interior, a different story emerges. It is a story not of steel, but of spirit. It is a narrative of an ancient longing that has refused to be extinguished by the pressures of modernity or the mandates of ideology. This is the story of Christianity in China today, a faith that is growing with a quiet, relentless intensity, flourishing in the very shadows where it was once thought to be erased. Despite decades of official restrictions and a complex, often strained relationship with the state, the Christian community in China has become one of the most resilient and dynamic spiritual movements in the world. Current estimates suggest that tens of millions of people across the country now identify as Christian, a figure that continues to rise despite the absence of public advertising, grand cathedrals, or televised crusades. This growth is a profound paradox. In a society that has spent nearly a century promoting a worldview centered on the tangible and the material, the hunger for the transcendent has not diminished, it has deepened. For many modern Chinese citizens, caught in a hyper-competitive environment where success is measured by output and social status, the message of the gospel offers something the market cannot provide: a sense of intrinsic, unshakable worth that exists independently of one's economic contribution or political standing. The lived experience of this faith is defined by a unique kind of persistence, most notably manifested in the house church movement. Because the state requires all religious activities to be conducted within registered, government-sanctioned organizations, a vast portion of the Christian population has chosen to worship in informal, unregistered settings. These are not churches in the architectural sense. They are living rooms, rented office spaces, storefronts, and remote farmhouses. In these intimate environments, faith is stripped of its institutional grandeur and returned to its communal, apostolic roots. Here, the underground church is not a clandestine political cell, but a community of families and neighbors who gather to pray, sing, and study in a space they feel is truly their own. The atmosphere in these gatherings is one of quiet, focused intensity. Believers often arrive in small groups, timing their entrance to avoid drawing the attention of local authorities or neighborhood committees. They sing their hymns in hushed tones, their voices blending into a soft murmur that rarely reaches beyond the walls of the apartment. There is a profound sense of shared risk that binds these people together, a solidarity born of the knowledge that their presence there is a conscious choice with potential social consequences. In the house church, faith is not a casual Sunday habit. It is an identity maintained through a daily negotiation with the world around them. Yet, to speak with these men and women is not to encounter a people living in a state of constant misery or fear. Instead, one finds a deep, abiding sense of peace and a sophisticated, quiet wisdom. They describe their faith as an internal sanctuary that the external world cannot touch. They navigate the boundaries of the state with a patient, discerning grace, following the laws of the land where they can, while keeping their ultimate spiritual allegiance for something they believe is eternal. This is not a movement of angry protesters or political dissidents. It is a movement of teachers, engineers, farmers, and students who believe that their faith makes them better citizens, more compassionate neighbors, and more honest workers. The pressure they face is real and multifaceted. In recent years, the push for the sinicization of religion has meant that even registered churches must ensure their architecture, their hymns, and even their theology align with Chinese traditional culture and contemporary political values. For many, this feels like an attempt to domesticate a faith that is, by its very nature, universal and independent. Surveillance has become a constant companion in the life of the believer. Cameras often stand guard at the entrances of sanctioned churches, and digital footprints are carefully monitored to track religious associations. In some regions, crosses have been removed from the skylines of cities where they were once prominent, replaced by the flat, secular geometry of the modern state. However, the history of the human spirit suggests that belief often thrives when it is placed under pressure. In China, Christianity has evolved into a movement of the people rather than an imposition from the outside. It is no longer seen as the religion of the foreign missionary, but as a deeply Chinese expression of a universal longing. The growth is particularly visible among the new urbanites, the young professionals who have moved to the cities in search of a better life, only to find a sense of spiritual vacuum. For them, the church offers a moral framework and a sense of belonging in a society that is moving at a dizzying, often isolating speed. The resilience of the modern Chinese Christian is not a new phenomenon. It is a trait that was forged in the fires of the past, at a time when the very survival of the faith hung in the balance. The quiet perseverance seen in a high-rise apartment in Beijing today is the same spirit that sustained believers through the dynastic upheavals of the 19th century and the radical transformations of the 20th. It is a testament to the endurance of the human heart's search for meaning, a search that remains constant regardless of the political or social landscape. To understand how a community learns to endure such prolonged pressure, one must look at the stories they tell themselves about their own history. They look back to moments where they felt a sense of divine protection in the midst of overwhelming odds. One such story, preserved with great reverence in the Catholic tradition, takes us to a small village in the Hebei province at the turn of the 20th century. It is a story of a siege, a woman in white, and a moment of survival that would define the identity of Chinese believers for generations to come. This historical account serves as a bridge between the struggles of the past and the perseverance of the present, illustrating the profound symbolic power that faith holds for those who feel surrounded by the forces of history. As the sun sets over the modern cities, the prayers in the house churches begin. They are the same prayers whispered centuries ago, carried forward by a people who have learned that the most powerful form of presence is often the one that is the most silent. The story of Christianity in China is not about a clash of civilizations or a political conflict. It is a story of a quiet river finding its way through the mountains, a story of the human spirit's refusal to be confined to the material world alone. It is a journey of faith, persistence, and a hope that remains as steady as the dawn. The year was 1900, and the air across the North China Plain was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the heavy silence of dread. The Boxer Rebellion had ignited like a wildfire across the countryside, driven by a desperate, populist fury against foreign influence and the perceived erosion of traditional Chinese values. At the heart of this storm were the Chinese Christians, seen by the insurgents as followers of a foreign religion, and therefore symbols of the very forces the Boxers sought to eradicate. It was a time of absolute vulnerability, where the survival of a community depended entirely on its isolation or its courage. For the Catholic families in the small, dusty village of Donglu in the Hebei province, the summer of that year was the ultimate test of their conviction. Donglu was not a place of strategic military importance, nor was it a grand city of commerce. It was a humble agricultural hamlet, yet it had become a Catholic stronghold through the quiet work of Vincentian missionaries. As the Boxer insurgency swelled, thousands of Christians from the surrounding countryside fled their homes, carrying little more than their rosaries and the clothes on their backs, seeking refuge within the village perimeter. By June, over 700 local residents were joined by nearly 3,000 refugees. They were a community of the dispossessed, surrounded by a force of nearly 10,000 boxers, supplemented by imperial soldiers with modern artillery. The disparity was staggering. The defenders had little in the way of modern weaponry. They were farmers and families, women and children, huddled together in prayer, while the horizon glowed with the fires of burning missions in the neighboring districts. According to Catholic tradition and the oral histories passed down through generations, the climax of this tension occurred during a particularly fierce assault. As the villagers braced for what seemed like an inevitable breakthrough, a collective experience began to take hold, one that would be preserved in the testimonies of the survivors for over a century. Believers recount that a radiant light suddenly broke through the dust and smoke of the battlefield. Within that light, they described seeing a woman in white standing in the sky above the village, surrounded by a soft, shimmering radiance. In the accounts preserved by the faithful, this figure was identified as the Virgin Mary. Some witnesses claimed to see a majestic warrior on a white horse, interpreted as Saint Michael the Archangel, riding beside her as if to form a celestial vanguard over the terrified villagers. The tradition holds that the sight of these figures sowed such profound confusion and inexplicable dread among the attacking Boxer forces that they broke their ranks and fled. To the Boxers, who were deeply attuned to the spiritual and the supernatural, this was an omen they could not ignore. The assault faltered, and the village was spared a massacre that, by all material logic, should have been inevitable. It is important to view this account with the respect due to a faith-based testimony. From a strictly historical perspective, such events are difficult to verify with empirical evidence. Skeptics might point to the psychological effects of extreme stress, the play of light through dust clouds, or atmospheric phenomena common to the plains. However, for the Chinese Catholic community, the Our Lady of Donglu is not a matter of scientific proof, but of profound symbolic and spiritual truth. The apparition represented a mother who did not remain distant in a foreign land, but who stepped into the dust and danger of a Chinese village to stand with her people. In the years following the rebellion, this event transformed Donglu into a sacred landscape. The villagers and the wider Catholic community did something remarkable to commemorate the protection they felt they had received. They did not rely on the traditional Western tropes of religious art. Instead, they commissioned a painting that depicted the Virgin Mary in the magnificent, embroidered silk robes of a Chinese empress from the Qing dynasty. She was shown holding a Christ child who was also dressed in the imperial yellow of the Middle Kingdom. This image, which would eventually be formally recognized as Our Lady of China, was a bold declaration of a profound cultural synthesis. It suggested that the gospel was not a borrowed garment, but a reality that could be expressed through the very highest aesthetic of Chinese tradition. This imagery bridged the gap between a universal theology and a local heart. It allowed the believers to feel that their spiritual devotion was in no way a betrayal of their heritage or their identity as children of the Middle Kingdom. Donglu became a site of massive annual pilgrimages, where thousands would walk for miles across the plains to honor the memory of a protection they believed was divine. The grand Gothic-style church that was eventually built there stood as a monument to the idea that even when surrounded by overwhelming force, a community is never truly alone if it holds fast to its convictions. However, the legacy of Donglu is not just about a single moment in 1900. It is about the theology of protection that it provided for the century of hardship that followed. The memory of the woman in white became a mental sanctuary for Chinese Catholics during the decades of the Cultural Revolution, when public worship was banned and churches were destroyed. When the external buildings were gone, the believers returned to the interior image of the mother who protects the village. They realized that while walls of mud or stone could be torn down, the celestial wall of their faith remained intact. The story of the apparition is presented today, not as a weapon of political conflict or a claim of supernatural superiority, but as a narrative of human resilience. It is a faith-based historical account that highlights the quiet perseverance of a people who have often felt besieged by the forces of history. It reminds the modern viewer that for the Chinese Christian, faith is often experienced as a hidden strength, a light that appears when the night is at its darkest. The transformation of a terrifying siege into a moment of sacred memory is perhaps the greatest miracle of Donglu, providing a blueprint for how a community can endure pressure without losing its soul. As we look at the village today, we see that the physical church has been rebuilt and the pilgrimages continue, though often under the watchful eye of the state. The symbolic power of Our Lady of China remains a vital part of the identity of millions. It serves as a reminder that the spiritual landscape of the nation is not a monolith, but a tapestry of stories, some written in the ink of official history and others whispered in the prayers of a village that refused to disappear. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the broader history of how this faith first reached the shores and plains of China, moving from the ancient Silk Road to the modern digital age. To understand the modern resilience of the Chinese church and the spiritual depth of places like Donglu, we must look further back than the 20th century. The story of the cross in China is not a recent arrival or a modern colonial imposition. It is a saga that spans over 1,300 years, characterized by a recurring cycle of arrival, flourishing, disappearance, and rebirth. It is the story of a faith that has continually sought to translate itself into the language and culture of the Middle Kingdom, proving that the spiritual landscape of China is far more complex than any single political ideology can encompass. The first seeds were planted in the 7th century, during the height of the Tang dynasty, an era known for its cosmopolitan openness and intellectual curiosity. In the year 635, a group of Persian monks led by a bishop named Alopan traveled the grueling length of the Silk Road to reach the imperial capital of Chang'an. These early believers did not come as conquerors or political agents. They came as scholars and mystics, presenting their faith as the Jingjiao, or the luminous religion. Emperor Taizong, one of the most celebrated rulers in Chinese history, welcomed these travelers with a level of tolerance that would be enviable even today. He allowed them to translate their sacred texts in the imperial library and granted them permission to build monasteries. This era of the luminous religion left behind one of the most important archaeological artifacts in the history of global Christianity, the Nestorian stele. This massive limestone monument, erected in the year 781, describes the tenets of the faith in elegant Chinese calligraphy. What is most striking about the stele is its cultural synthesis. It describes Christian concepts using the vocabulary of Taoism and Buddhism, speaking of the way and the virtues of compassion. It depicts the cross emerging from a lotus flower, a powerful visual metaphor for a faith that had found a home in Eastern soil. This was not a foreign religion forced upon a people. It was a conversation between two great civilizations. However, the history of faith in China is often a history of shifting political winds. In the 9th century, a period of imperial backlash against foreign influences led to the suppression of the luminous religion, along with other faiths like Buddhism. The monasteries were closed, the monks were dispersed, and for several centuries, the luminous religion seemed to vanish from the Chinese heartland, buried under the shifting sands of the Silk Road. Yet, the river had not dried up. It had simply gone underground, waiting for a new season to emerge. The second great encounter occurred during the Yuan dynasty, when the Mongols reopened the trade routes between East and West. Franciscan missionaries traveled from Europe to the court of Kublai Khan, finding that remnants of the earlier Christian presence still existed among the nomadic tribes of the north. But the most sophisticated cultural bridge was built later, in the 16th century, during the Ming dynasty. This was the era of the Jesuits, led by the legendary Matteo Ricci. Rixai remains a model for respectful cultural engagement. He did not attempt to erase Chinese identity. Instead, he immersed himself in it. He spent years mastering the Chinese language, studied the Confucian classics, and adopted the robes of a Chinese scholar. He recognized that for the faith to take root, it had to be expressed through the existing moral and philosophical framework of the nation. He engaged the Chinese elite not through theological arguments alone, but through science, cartography, and mathematics. He presented a world map that showed China its place in a wider global community and demonstrated clocks and prisms that fascinated the imperial court. Rixai argued that the ancient Chinese concept of Shangdi, the Lord of Heaven, was the same creator described in the Christian scriptures. This was a period of mutual wonder, a brief window where the wisdom of the West and the East looked at one another with genuine respect. Yet, this harmony was fragile and eventually succumbed to the rights controversy of the 18th century. A theological dispute within the Catholic Church over whether Chinese converts should be allowed to continue traditional ancestral rites led to a tragic breakdown in relations. When the Vatican banned these practices, the king-emperors viewed it as an intolerable interference in Chinese social and familial order. The result was a period of proscription. The faith was pushed out of the imperial palaces and into the rural hinterlands. It was during this time that the faith became truly indigenous. Deprived of foreign priests and official support, it was kept alive by ordinary families in small villages. It became a folk religion, passed down through oral tradition and secret prayer, much like it had been during the earlier centuries of suppression. By the 19th century, the narrative of Christianity in China became tragically entangled with a century of humiliation. As Western powers used military force to open Chinese ports, missionaries often arrived under the protection of unequal treaties. This created a painful tension that remains a sensitive topic today. For many Chinese patriots, the cross became associated with the gunboat, a symbol of foreign encroachment. It was this historical resentment that fueled the Boxer Rebellion of 19, the very conflict that led to the siege of Donglu. But this perspective overlooks the millions of Chinese believers who had nothing to do with geopolitics. For the farmer in Hebei or the mother in a coastal village, the faith was not about empires. It was about a personal encounter with a God who valued the marginalized. They were not rice Christians seeking material gain. They were men and women who remained faithful even when their choice brought them into direct conflict with their society. They saw the faith not as a foreign import, but as an ancient truth that had finally returned to their soil. The history of Christianity in China is, therefore, a history of translation. It is the story of a faith that has been lost and found, suppressed and reborn, constantly shedding its foreign skin to reveal a Chinese heart. When we look at the quiet growth of the church today, we are seeing the resurgence of an ancient river that has always found its way through the mountains. The resilience we witness in the modern house church is the same resilience that sustained the luminous religion in the Tang dynasty and the hidden believers of the Qing era. It is a testament to the fact that the spiritual search for meaning is a permanent feature of the Chinese soul, one that transcends the rise and fall of dynasties and the changing of political seasons. In the modern era, the pressure on the Christian community in China has not disappeared. It has simply changed its form, moving from the overt violence of the past to a sophisticated, high-tech system of management and ideological alignment. This current phase is defined by the policy of sinicization, a term that officially refers to the indigenization of religion, but which many believers experience as a systemic effort to subordinate their spiritual life to the political and social goals of the state. It is a world where the sacred and the secular are in a constant, delicate dance of negotiation, and where the act of worship often requires a quiet, steely resolve. Since 2018, New regulations on religious affairs have fundamentally altered the landscape for both registered and unregistered churches. The state's vision for a Sinicized Christianity involves more than just a cultural aesthetic. It mandates that the theology, the leadership, and the very architecture of the church reflect the core socialist values of the nation. In registered churches, this can mean the prominent display of the national flag, the singing of patriotic songs alongside traditional hymns, and the requirement that sermons incorporate modern political thought. For many, these measures feel like an attempt to domesticate a faith that is, by its very nature, universal and independent of any earthly authority. This pressure is amplified by the sheer scale of modern surveillance. In contemporary China, technology has become a silent participant in religious life. Facial recognition cameras are frequently installed at the entrances of sanctioned places of worship, creating a digital record of who attends and how often. For a citizen whose career or social standing depends on their social credit score, the simple act of entering a church can become a calculated risk. This has led to a cooling effect in some urban areas, where the public practice of faith is increasingly seen as a marker of being out of step with the prevailing social harmony. However, the response of the Christian community has not been one of loud protest, but of creative adaptation. As the space for large, organized worship has been squeezed, the church has once again fragmented into smaller, more resilient cells. We are witnessing the rise of a new kind of house church, one that is often hidden in plain sight. In the bustling business districts of cities like Beijing or Chengdu, believers no longer meet only in homes. They meet in rented office spaces, in the back of factories, or in quiet corners of coffee shops. They have learned that a business meeting or a study group can serve as a shield for a community of prayer. The digital world has also become a new frontier for this quiet perseverance. Despite strict bans on unlicensed religious content online and the removal of Bibles from major internet retailers, the message continues to circulate through encrypted apps and peer-to-peer networks. When the state blocked online sermons, the community turned to small group voice chats and private digital fellowships. This is a digital tabernacle, a space where the faith is preserved and passed on in a world that is increasingly monitored by the silicon eye of the state. The personal cost of this perseverance remains high. In recent years, several high-profile leaders of large, unregistered churches have been detained or imprisoned, charged with crimes such as illegal business operations or inciting subversion of state power. These legal measures are often aimed at the leadership, with the goal of scattering the flock. Yet, the history of the last few years shows that when a large church is closed, it does not disappear. Instead, it births dozens of smaller, clandestine groups that are even harder to monitor. This is the paradox of pressure in the Chinese context. The more the state attempts to consolidate and control the faith, the more decentralized and resilient it becomes. This endurance is not fueled by political ambition, but by a profound sense of lived reality. For the modern Chinese believer, faith provides a moral anchor in a society undergoing rapid, often disorienting change. In an environment where traditional values have been eroded by decades of upheaval, and where the pressure to succeed is relentless, the church offers a community of trust and a framework for meaning. They find in the gospel a call to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, leading them to engage in quiet acts of service, from caring for the elderly to supporting migrant workers. The story of faith in modern China is therefore one of a quiet, unyielding continuity. It is a story of parents who continue to teach their children about God in the privacy of their homes, even when religious instruction for minors is officially prohibited. It is a story of students who find in their faith a reason to live with integrity in a competitive academic world. It is a story of endurance that does not seek to win a battle against the state, but simply to outlast the storm. As we move toward the final reflection on this journey, we see that the Christians of China are not looking for a sudden political transformation. They have learned from their long history that empires and ideologies are transient, while the search for the eternal is permanent. They find their hope not in the changing winds of policy, but in the steady light of their convictions. This is a faith that has been stripped of its external grandeur and returned to its most essential form, a quiet, daily commitment to live with grace under pressure. The story of Christianity in China is ultimately not a story of institutions, but a story of the human heart's quiet refusal to abandon its search for the eternal. As we look toward the future of this silent growth, we find a movement that has moved past the need for external validation or the comfort of public approval. It is a faith that has been distilled by history, a river that has learned to flow through the hardest of rocks by sheer, patient persistence. The future of this community is not found in a grand political climax or a sudden shift in the official landscape, but in the steady, generational continuity of people who have found a home in the luminous religion. This continuity is perhaps best reflected in the way the memory of Donglu survives in the modern era. The village today remains a symbol of that sacred sanctuary that exists beyond the reach of any secular power. Even when the roads to the village are blocked or the pilgrimages are restricted, the internal map of the believer remains unchanged. They have learned that the protection they seek is not a physical wall, but a spiritual state of being. This realization has created a specific kind of hope within the Chinese Christian soul, a hope that is not based on a prediction of better times, but on a conviction of current presence. They do not wait for the night to end to find their light. They find it in the act of remaining faithful while the night is still dark. The new urbanites of the digital age are carrying this legacy into the heart of the world's rising superpower. In the coming decades, the impact of these millions of believers will likely be felt not through political activism, but through the quiet leavening of Chinese society. As Christians enter the professions of law, medicine, technology, and education, they bring with them a set of values: integrity, compassion, and a belief in the inherent dignity of the individual that provide a stabilizing moral force in a rapidly changing nation. They are becoming the silent backbone of a new Chinese civil society, one that seeks to bless the nation from the bottom up, rather than the top down. One of the most significant aspects of this future is the total normalization of the faith. Christianity in China is no longer a guest. It is no longer a foreign import or a vestige of a colonial past. It has become as much a part of the Chinese landscape as the ancient pagodas or the modern bullet trains. By expressing their devotion through their own cultural vocabulary, much like the imperial robes of Our Lady of China, these believers have bridged the gap between their spiritual identity and their national pride. They have proven that to be Christian is not to be less Chinese, but to bring a new dimension of spiritual depth to the Chinese experience. The pressure on the community will likely remain a constant feature of life for the foreseeable future. The boundaries of what is permitted will expand and contract with the shifting priorities of the state. There will be seasons of relative openness and seasons of renewed tightening. However, the history of the last 1400 years suggests that the flame is now too large to be put out. Having survived the total prohibition of the Cultural Revolution and the existential threats of the 19th century, the modern church views current restrictions with the calm perspective of a long-distance runner. They know that while the state focuses on the management of the external, the internal remains free. The story ends, therefore, on a note of quiet hope and profound continuity. It is a hope rooted in the character of the people who have walked this path before. It is the hope of the grandmother in a rural village who still recites her prayers by heart, the hope of the young tech worker who finds community in a secret fellowship, and the hope of a people who believe that every trial is an opportunity for a deeper resilience. They do not ask for an easy road. They ask for the strength to walk the road they have been given. As the sun sets over the North China Plain, and the lights of the great cities begin to flicker on, the silent growth continues. In thousands of apartments, storefronts, and rural homes, people gather to whisper the same prayers that have sustained their ancestors through dynasties and revolutions. They are a people of the long view, understanding that they are part of a story that is much older than the current era and much larger than any single nation. The cross in China has become a Chinese cross, carved from the wood of the land and carried by the strength of its people. It is a testament to the fact that faith, when it is authentic, does not seek to conquer. It seeks to endure. And in that endurance, it transforms the world around it. The luminous religion continues to shine, a steady, unyielding light in the heart of the Middle Kingdom, reminding us all that the most powerful forces in history are often the ones that make the least noise.